Welcome back to the Royal Palace Podcast. On this episode, we are covering the Eloka Ferry case of 1921.
I've ordered every federal agency to eliminate rules that don't make sense.
It's the usual French talk, stall and surrender.
All scientists dying on footprints. The cultural form of the nation.
You Americans have given us such. The sense was very evil.
Make our planet great again.
Decided by the Tribunal of Conflicts in 1921, the so-called Eloka Ferry case, or Bec d'Eloka, is a story of colonial governance, disregard for human life, and the line between industry and public service, and of course, racism. Before diving into the facts, I want to just quickly remind our listeners what the Tribunal of Conflicts is and how it works. So Liam, on episode 2, we talked about the Tribunal of Conflicts. Do you remember what it was?
What I remember, the Tribunal of Conflicts is the court that decides whether something is under the jurisdiction of the Council of State or the Court of Cassation. Is that right?
So as Liam stated, the Tribunal of Conflicts' role is to determine jurisdictional questions, right? Where it's not clear whether or not a given dispute belongs to the judiciary, as we call it, or to the administrative jurisdiction. So as Liam reminded us, the Council of State is the head of the administrative jurisdiction, while the Court of Cassation is the Supreme Court of the judicial jurisdiction.
This goes back to the core distinction in French law that we talked at length about on episode 2 between private law and public or administrative law. The two have completely separate court systems. So when Patrick says the judicial jurisdiction here, he's talking about the courts that deal with private law. And when he says the administrative jurisdiction, he's talking about the courts that deal with public or administrative law.
As we've hinted at previously, discerning the respective competencies of each jurisdiction is easy in theory, but becomes more difficult in practice. As a result, the Tribunal of Conflicts can only be called upon to resolve these disputes on a given legal question. So they don't actually resolve cases themselves, they merely resolve these sort of procedural competency disputes. So cases come before the Tribunal of Conflicts when a case has already been brought before a court of a given jurisdiction. So this is whereby the parties or the judge call into question the court's own competency in a given matter, and thus referring the question to the Tribunal of Conflicts. So Liam, do you know where the Tribunal of Conflicts can be found?
Is it in the Royal Palace?
That's right. The Tribunal of Conflicts is located in Palais Royal, the namesake of our podcast, which is in the heart of Paris, along with the Council of State, the Constitutional Council, as well as the Ministry of Culture. Now, with these procedural questions out of the way, let's talk about where this case actually takes place. So, the case we're looking at today takes place in the Ivory Coast, which at the time, in 1921, was a French colony. French colonization was unquestionably brutal and deserves an entire series dedicated to it, so we can't do justice to it here. But from a legal point of view, what makes the French colonial system unique is the extent to which its administration and courts were deeply integrated with those of metropolitan France.
So if you don't remember what the term metropolitan France means, we talked about that in episode 1. It's a term used in France to refer to mainland France, essentially. What is also known as the hexagon, that is the European part of France, which is relevant now only when you're talking about France's remaining overseas possessions like New Caledonia or Reunion Island or French Guiana in South America. But in the times of colonization, it was a very important distinction, France versus the colonies. And, a similar term was used, the metropole, in other colonial countries.
So yeah, all this means that, in other words, France sought to rule its colonies as if they were departments of mainland France, imposing French laws, administration, and culture upon its colonial inhabitants. Today, as we mentioned in our first episode, this remains largely the case in France's current overseas territories.
And different from how a lot of other colonial countries approached their colonies. Britain never wanted treat as colonies, like they were part of Britain.
Right. And also, as like British and American colonial models sought their own sort of legal and administrative systems, they also didn't engage in the same civilizing missions that and I say that with air quotes.
Quote unquote civilizing missions, yeah.
Yeah, that the French undertook. That doesn't mean, right, that the British or the Americans saw their colonial possessions as, or sorry, their colonial subjects as any more or less civil than the French, but just that the French had this desire to essentially make the elites or to create a class of elites in their respective colonies that would reflect French values and French culture and French administrative culture, and they were expected to learn French and essentially adopt Western quote unquote customs, right?
Yeah. If you somehow are not aware of this, like you've never interacted with a French person, the French are very, very proud of their ideals and culture. So it's not surprising they wanted to impose that on all of Africa.
So take Puerto Rico, for example, right? Like when we're contrasting these two colonial models. The island does not enjoy statehood status, right? So it really doesn't have the same status as the 50 states. It maintains an internal court system that's unique to it, and it is subject to so-called insular law. Now, it is possible to access from Puerto Rico the Supreme Court, but that's really exceptional, right? It's not like the Supreme Court is involved in daily affairs in Puerto Rico. Instead, it's their own imposed by Congress internal court system.
The British colonies that remained in the late 20th century had a different citizenship status. They didn't even it was, British citizenship, but it was British citizenship parentheses overseas. And the remaining British territories like Bermuda or the Falkland Islands, say, are still not they're not treated as being part of Britain. They don't get to vote in British elections. They don't get to send British people to British Parliament, whereas all of the remaining French possessions do. They vote for the president, they send people to Parliament.
Yeah, now let us be clear. In 1921, though, this conception of France's overseas territories, colonial possessions, was not completely there. Citizens of French colonies were not French until somewhere in the 20th century. So even though today these models kind of look very different, they weren't necessarily always that different in the early 20th century. But I mean, they had substantive differences that we've already covered. But yeah, it's not like everyone was French citizens in the beginning of the
No,
20th
no.
century. Now, let us be clear, nothing about these colonial models hindered colonial brutality or extraction, never mind the cruel apparatuses of counterinsurgency that both the French, British, and Americans would eventually adopt in putting down colonial resistance that would come in the 20th century. Also, that's not to exclude that there was colonial resistance long before in these colonies, before the 20th century. So let's now look specifically at the Ivory Coast as it was in the early 20th century. The history of the Ivory Coast, of course, deserves more attention than we are able to give it, and I hope that one day we can bring on a guest who can give you that important story. Nevertheless, we will try to give you a brief introduction into the West African nation, such that the colonial context is not lost on our listeners. So, prior to French colonization efforts in the mid 17th century, Portuguese took an interest in Africa, including the modern day territory of the Ivory Coast, as a part of the slave trade. Now, French colonial expansion into West Africa occurred under the Second Empire, but suffered a major blow as France lost the Franco Prussian War, as we talked about on our first episode. Even though France backed off some of its colonies for a time following its defeat, unfortunately for all of the colonial subjects, they were ultimately not deterred, especially as France saw itself in competition with Britain in West Africa.
Yeah, and that later part of the 19th century was sort of the peak of the European rush for Africa, especially because before then, the interior of the continent was largely unaccessible to Europeans.
So by the turn of the 20th century, France, through colonial violence, which we again hope to come back to on a future episode, managed to control, in the colonial sense, most of West Africa, including the Ivory Coast. I want to just be clear on a sort of a terminology point here. Colonial control is always kind of tricky to define, right? It sort of implies that there's some sort of civil peace that is obtained and that, the state has a meaningful control in the same way that like the state in Europe would have a meaningful control over the population. This is not really true. or not usually how it actually works, because often what it really looks like is more of a constant police state in which the state is putting down kind of active rebellion, especially in more interior parts of colonial holdings. So I just want to say that, like, just because there's a colonial power that claims to have control over a whole territory doesn't actually mean they meaningfully control that territory in a that might be an obvious point, but I feel like it's kind of passed over a bit quickly.
Yeah, it's not necessarily an obvious point if you don't know the history, because a lot of people see the colonial map and yeah, interpret those borders as they would modern nation state borders, but it really wasn't like that, especially for most of colonization. For most of colonization, up until the second half of the 19th century, those claims were largely ridiculous. Like the Portuguese claims and stuff, like they controlled forts and trading posts along the coast of West Africa, but they never touched the interior, basically.
Like, the state in France has an interest in controlling the entirety of the French territory, whereas in, like, West Africa, for example, it only has an interest in controlling the territory that's relevant for its extractive purposes, right?
Yep.
Of course, the main driver of colonization is always economic, i.e., through the extraction of natural resources, by exploiting or enslaving or forcing local labor, financed by metropolitan capital, and for the exportation, typically to the metropole. It is important to remember that the colonial enterprises were typically private ventures, but that were sanctioned, facilitated, and encouraged by the state.
Yes, and you obviously could not operate without the military backing of the state.
Exactly. So the state is therefore by no means any sort of bystander, and often fulfilled the essential role of ensuring that infrastructure was built for the purpose of making exportation and extraction possible, and by providing physical security to colonists. In the Ivory Coast specifically, the exports were typically rubber, coffee, coca, and palm oil. So during the early 20th century, France began meaningfully building out its administrative structures in the colony and sought to cultivate a local elite that could only unlock French citizenship once they had reached a certain assimilation in the eyes of the French. It would only be by the Fourth Republic that France would finally grant African subjects meaningful citizenship from 1946 after the fall of Vichy. And I know we're skipping over a bunch of history here, but the Ivory Coast would eventually obtain its independence in 1960. And of course, today, the Ivory Coast remains heavily influenced by France, with French remaining the official language of the country. And their legal system, too, was constructed in the image of France, including a court of cassation, a council of state, and a constitutional council.
And that's also true for most of France's former African colonies, which all have different degrees of relationship with France today. There's been especially a subject in the news lately, which I'm sure hopefully we'll cover at some point, with a number of West African countries kicking out the French military, especially countries in the Sahel.
It's interesting, right? Because there was a while where it felt like France had ended colonization or ended its colonial project in most of Africa, and took up like a sort of neo-colonial project, right?
Yeah. Which in France is called the France Afrique, is a commonly used term to refer to uh, France's very close connections with its former colonies.
Right, and the pun there is France Afrique.
Is there a pun there?
Yeah, like France Afrique, money.
Oh. Ah. I never got that.
Yeah.
Don't put in that I never got that. But
So
say the part about the pun.
so France Afrique obviously means France Africa, but when you say it, when you add a space in between a and fric, it sounds like you're saying France Afrique, which literally means France of money, or French money. I don't know. France Afrique, like, yeah. Anyway, it's an allusion to France's involvement in, I don't want to use the word corrupting, but certainly
Mm,
influencing politics in Africa post colonial control.
yeah, and it varies a lot depending on the country. Some countries like Algeria has a largely quite bad relationship with France for historical reasons. So even there, it's complicated. But there are some countries in West Africa that France has long almost controlled, and where almost all their trade is with France, and French companies control all the mining operations and so on. Especially true in Niger until recently,
Yeah.
or Niger. I'm not sure how you're supposed to say that in English.
Well, and remember that France is a highly nuclearized country, right? Like a lot of the electricity in France comes from nuclear power. But of course, that requires the extraction of uranium, found in large quantities in the African continent, and motivates a lot of France's economic relationship with many of the countries there.
Oh yeah.
So let's get into the facts of the case. Due to the geography of the Ivory Coast, it was difficult for colonists to develop extractive infrastructure. This is particularly the case because of the Ebrier Lagoon, which stretches 130 kilometers between the actual coastline of the Ivory Coast and the interior of the country. It's sort of like a big moat, if you will, that prevents access or easy access to the interior of the country from say a port. So this made constructing roads and railways extremely costly. In fact, today only a handful of bridges actually cross this lagoon. So, in order to facilitate the crossing of the lagoon during colonial times, the government began to operate a ferry service transporting persons and goods. However, on the 5th of September 1920, you always know something good is going to happen when you hear a date. This very ferry sunk while carrying 18 passengers and 4 vehicles. Only one person, a colonial subject, died.
By colonial subject, you mean a local.
That's right. The West African Commercial Company was the owner of one of the vehicles, at least one of the vehicles that was on this boat, and it essentially brought suit or intended to bring suit against the colonial government. And they did this by ordering or by requesting that the Civil Tribunal of Grand Bassam, so that's the capital, the colonial capital of the Ivory Coast, ordered that an expertise be done in order to determine the amount of damage that they suffered as a result of the vessel's sinking. Now, by the way, this is a key point about civil law or the way civil law is practiced in civil law countries, which is that typically courts appoint experts as opposed to opposing parties bringing their own respective experts. So, for example, if there's, I don't know, an issue in which your house collapses because of a poor construction, it won't be up to you and the opposing party to determine the actual physical damage of what happened. It will be up to the court who will appoint an expert to do so. And the idea is that these experts are supposed to be independent and not have an interest in one or the other party, right? This kind of opposes to the very American notion where it's like, no, even the experts, right? Like you can go to a medical trial in the US and each side has their own doctors who may say absolutely opposing things.
Mhm.
And the idea is that the jury is supposed to be able to sort of decipher the difference there. In France, the idea is that no, we just want one answer to this question, and it's up to the court to ensure that that happens. So, as a result, the lieutenant governor of the Ivory Coast, on the 13th of October 1920, by way of telegram, requested that the matter be brought before the Tribunal of Conflicts, since he believed that the administrative jurisdiction was rightfully competent to hear the matter. So, let's take a step back. By bringing it before the Civil Tribunal of Grand Bassam, the West African Commercial Company was essentially operating under the assumption that the damages resulting from the sinking of the ferry are a question for private law, a question for the judicial jurisdiction, as we call it in France. But, of course, this ferry was operated by a public entity, the government of France in the colony of the Ivory Coast. So the question that the lieutenant governor raised was whether or not it actually does belong to the judicial jurisdiction or to the administrative jurisdiction. Now, Liam, do you have any idea why this might be a relevant question?
I guess I assume compensation would work differently depending on. I'm not sure.
So, as we stated on an earlier podcast episode, the idea of having two separate constitutionally protected jurisdictions is that one jurisdiction is, and that's the judicial jurisdiction, is supposed to take into account individual private interests and sort of rule objectively, right? Treating each private party equally, and that's kind of the basis of private law, right? Whereas the administrative jurisdiction is supposed to take into account that there's an all-powerful administration who should enjoy certain freedoms in order to execute the public interest,
Right.
right? That the public interest is greater than private interest. Therefore, it needs, on one hand, the private person needs to be protected from its excesses, but on the other hand, the administration needs to be empowered in the name of the public interest.
As an aside, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense to Americans who are sort of used to the concept that the government should be, act and be treated like a business. But under this conception, the argument very much would be that a public transportation company run by the state is, yeah, less at fault for killing you than a private company would be. Or they're not less at fault, but they should face less consequences because it is assumed that what they are doing is in the public interest.
Right. Like, let's take this very colonial context, for example. So we have the West African commercial company who whose task is to extract natural resources from the Ivory Coast for ostensibly French interests, right? And the on the other hand, the state has recognized that if it does not operate a ferry service, no one will,
Hmm.
and therefore the interests of France will be harmed. So, isn't it in some way a little bit rich that the West African commercial company, whose exploitation could never be possible without this ferry service, could then turn back against the government and say, because you helped me on this, I'm going to still come back to you asking for full compensation of my damages.
Right.
Obviously, we're not defending anyone in this, any of the actors here, but I just want to be clear that like you could see this in another case where it's like imagine for example there's an island somewhere where it has become no longer profitable to operate ferry services. Yet, people living on this island need to get to mainland. So, perhaps the government should build something to meet that demand, but also like just that's a public service, right? So they're offering something that they don't need to offer. So perhaps it's justified to limit their liability and say, hey, look, it's just the cost of offering this service to you. So anyway, all this is to say is that for the lieutenant governor, the interest is in the administrative jurisdiction because they are hoping that the administrative court would, in light of the greater interest at play, be able to take into account the fact that colonial exploitation would not be possible without the ferry service. Therefore, damages resulting from its operation may not warrant full compensation. Meanwhile, of course, the private company here has an interest in it going before the judicial jurisdiction, right? Because on one hand, they want full compensation and they don't want to have to deal with any greater interest concerns. And they also want this goes beyond just the West African commercial company, but for all private companies, they would like some form of judicial security or legal certainty that any damages they suffer go fully repaired, right? They don't want to have to factor into their books every year that, hey, we might lose a couple cars because the government isn't the best at operating ferry services. Now, an interesting aspect of the different arguments going on here is that the administration, so the government of the Ivory Coast, is essentially alleging that the reason the boat went under is because it was overloaded. So likely because the West African commercial company may have put too much on the boat, more than was normally allowed. While the West African commercial company believes that actually the reason the ferry went under is because the administration did not sufficiently maintain the boat. So, from a legal perspective, there's sort of two opposing arguments here. So, there's in favor of administrative competence or administrative competency, the theory of public service, which basically says the very moment that the government is involved in providing a public service, it deserves the protection that it hopes to enjoy from the administrative jurisdiction. And on the other side, you have the theory of public power, which basically says that the administration should only enjoy protection when it's mobilizing something that only the state can do, right? So this
Hmm.
is a more restrictive view of competence because it would say that that when the government is acting as a private company, it doesn't deserve to be under the administrative jurisdiction.
That's interesting. So that is to say that the police, under this theory, the police should be protected from this kind of thing, or the military, but not when the government is operating a ferry or a bus or running a cinema or something like that.
That's right. Another example of this would be like issuing passports, right? Like only the government can issue passports. So it's necessarily a question of public power and therefore administrative jurisdiction. But if it's merely, as you say, like cinema, operating a cinema, why should they enjoy any sort of special protections that a private operator in the same circumstances would not enjoy? Underlying the public power theory is kind of this idea that kind of an early conception of competition, right? Because one of the concerns is that if the government is able to operate ferry services in a way that's different than that of private operators, that the public operators would essentially have a competitive advantage over their counterparts.
Yeah, I mean that kind of makes sense as an argument if you're willing to think about it with that kind of logic. It's kind of the logic the European Union applies with competition standards now. Is that under European Union law, a public company, of which there's many in Europe, cannot sort of compete on an unfair ground with private companies doing the same thing, right?
Right.
It's the same logic.
So yeah, on one hand, you have kind of this notion that like, public services that are offered in the same way as private services belong to judicial competency, right? Which again is going to favor full compensation, whereas the theory of public service kind of says like, no, there's something greater at play, even when the government is operating like a private operator. There's something in that's inherently of a greater value when the government offers a bus service than when a private operator offers a bus service. And I think there's some truth to that. I mean, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for one thing, they're not extracting a private profit. By definition, if they are profiting, it's going back to the state coffers. And they are also, again, technically, literally owned by the public, in theory. So, for those two reasons, I can see an argument that even if the government is doing the most private thing you could imagine, it is inherently different from a private company doing the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and I think look, I think there's negative effects to both interpretations. Like, for example, if you retain the administrative competency here, you could imagine a world in which forget the competition aspect, but in which the government essentially is operating as a private operator and just kind of snuffing out private activity, which, some people might argue is good. But you could also imagine where that might not be so great, right? Where it starts perhaps doing very anti-competitive practices just in order to keep its domination over the sector, I guess.
Yes, definitely, which is what some people argue that public train companies do in Europe.
But you could also argue that um, that the administrative jurisdiction, if you really believe that they're going to undercompensate victims, it could encourage the government to essentially operate its bus service dangerously, right? Which is obviously, even though they're in theory taking into account the public interest there, is it really in the public interest to recklessly operate a bus company because you'll enjoy some degree of protection in case of an issue?
Right. But it's complicated I suppose in cases which would be most things the government does where there isn't actually a direct private competitor. For example, if we take SNCF, the French National Train Company, there are private train operators, but no private train operator in Europe runs the same whole like systemic services that SNCF does. SNCF runs lots of local routes that are unprofitable and are done because they're legally required to. And a private operator would never want to operate those routes. So just because you can say, here's a train company and here's a train company, and they should be operating on the same basis, irrespective of the fact that one is public and one is private, when you really look into the things, it's not so simple. And that could be true of the ferry company too. I mean, as you said, it might not be fair to compare this ferry to a private ferry in a different location because possibly this is a particularly expensive and dangerous location, that private operator never would have started a route here. I mean, you're going to find very few instances where there is a government company competing with a private one doing the exact same thing.
By the way, I promised at the intro here that I would mention a bit of racism, and I think we implied a bit of that with colonization generally. But one thing I found in the records for the West African commercial company is that they marketed a product of or a strand of rubber that they called cranky N words. And so apparently, I mean, I couldn't find too much on the internet about this, but apparently using the N word to describe strands of rubber was fairly common at the time. So, shall we look at the decision, Liam?
Yes.
First of all, do you want to take a bet which way this comes out?
I would assume that it was decided to be a matter of public law, from what I understand.
Why?
Just because that my understanding is that's how it always goes with these things. If the public company is if it's a public service, it's public law.
All right, let's take a look at the decision. And I also want you to comment, if you can, on how this looks different, like format wise, to you than anything you've seen in common law. So at the beginning, we have a paragraph in which the court lays out the facts very briefly, right?
Hmm.
And then after that, we have a paragraph where they address whether or not the request to have this case heard by the Tribunal of Conflicts by the lieutenant governor was done conforming to law. And so they, very briefly say yes. Then they talk about, whether or not they have competency itself for the case at hand. And so all that's very standard, right? There's not much for us to talk about. But it's really this last paragraph here, or the second to last paragraph, I guess, where we get to the substance of the matter. So if you could read that for us, Liam.
Considering on the one hand that the Eloka Ferry does not constitute a public work, on the other hand that by carrying out for remuneration the operations of passage of pedestrians and cars from one bank of the lagoon to the other, the colony of the Ivory Coast operates a transport service under the same conditions as an ordinary industrialist, that consequently, in the absence of a special text conferring jurisdiction to the administrative court, it is for the judicial authority alone to deal with the harmful consequences of the accident cited, whether it was caused, according to the claims of the West African Company, by a fault committed in the operation or poor maintenance of the ferry. That if the president of the court, in view of the declinatory letter sent by the lieutenant governor, was therefore wrong not only to rule on the declinatory letter, but also to appoint an expert by the same order, contrary to Articles 7 and 8 of the Order of June 1st, 1828, he was right to retain knowledge of the dispute.
So, thoughts?
Well, I was wrong. They decided that this is a private law matter.
That's right. And the basis again is on the public power theory. They're saying that look, if you operate a service in the same conditions as an ordinary industrialist, right? We're looking at, I mean, this isn't said here, but we know from the case law that comes after and before that if you're charging for the service, right, and it's not massively subsidized, but like you're charging for usage, right? You pay €2 to get on this tram, 20 to get on this ferry, and you're sort of selling tickets under normal economic conditions. Basically, those are all indicators that you're operating as an industrialist would. Whereas when you're issuing passports, even if there's an administrative fee attached to it, that likely doesn't cover the whole cost of it. You're not selling like express services to certain clients. It's you're not pay to play, right? And so that's kind of the distinction that they draw here. But do you have any observations as to sort of the formatting of that paragraph you just read?
Not really. I've definitely read a lot more French legal rulings than American ones at this point, so I'm not sure exactly how this would look in America.
Well, I think one thing that's worth noting is that that was one paragraph and that was one sentence.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
Well, there was a couple
No, it's two.
sentences,
It's two sentences, I think. Yeah.
but like the first one is a real long
Yeah.
run on, right? But anyway, what you see here, and I think this is interesting, is that this, if you were to print this out, this would be one page of text.
Hmm.
I can't imagine seeing any decision in the U.S. being so short, right? And of course, there's no dissident opinions, right? There's no differing opinions. The court gives one single answer to the question. And also, I know this doesn't, a lot of people I think would hear this paragraph, a lot of Americans would hear this paragraph and say, "Oh my god, like, they rushed through that, like, they didn't really engage with the question, et cetera, et cetera." But the advantage of this is that, it's very clear what their logic was. And sure, the extent they could have justified it with a million footnotes, I guess. But ultimately, this makes the actual like consumption of law, like people who try to understand jurisprudence, somewhat easier, right? Because I mean, like the way this works, like among jurists in France, is like we literally memorize. I mean, not like word for word, but everyone memorizes these kind of like uh, holdings, if you will, right? Like if I was to write a brief or something, I would literally just say that operating under the same conditions as an ordinary industrialist. And the court knows that that's kind of how people read these things. So it makes its judicial production in this way. But as you'll notice, they don't put any doubt here. Like even in a decision, like an affirming decision, where the Supreme Court is going to, like for example, the Supreme Court of the U.S. The United States is going to bring forward an argument. They're going to like go over all the counter arguments and why they're wrong. You don't see that here. They just kind of come up with a holding, and that's the holding. There's no question of it. Even if in the Tribunal of Conflicts there may be disagreements, right, as to how this should come out. Once the court makes its holding, it's its holding.
And would any of those disagreements would those procedures be published, or is that all private?
All private.
Right. So the idea is that yeah, the court speaks with one voice as the law, and also they write their conclusion right here. Who are we to question that? This is an edict from the royal palace. But do you think this is partially because of the lesser place that precedence has in French law? That when an American court is writing, they're writing for all the other courts, for all the other judges to establish a sort of precedent, and therefore specifying what their logic was, what the specificities of this case were that may not apply to other things, and so on.
So no, I don't think that it has any explanatory power actually, because for one, decisions by the Tribunal of Conflicts essentially has precedent power. I mean, obviously, we wouldn't say that, but that is effectively what it is. I mean, if you wrote on, say, a bar exam copy, like on the bar exam, if you wrote that, oh well, we're not sure about whether or not this would be a question for the private jurisdiction, you would be wrong
Hmm.
because the answer is yes. It's the judicial jurisdiction, and you would literally cite Tribunal of Conflicts, 1921, back de Eloka.
So, do you have any theory about why it's different? Why it's the French decisions are so much shorter than the American ones?
I think one of the big aspects here is a conception of the law itself, right? This, as we alluded to previously, the idea in civil law is that there is always an answer to a given question in law, right? We don't believe in the theory that there are gaps in law. Americans and Brits love talking about gaps in the law. Right? The law has yet to answer this question. In fact, making a link to our episode the other day, I've seen some articles about the whole Telegram thing, where the headline is France is like going to uncharted territory or something along those lines. I think it was untested law or whatever. And it's just because the law that concerns the CEO of Telegram is relatively new, but they're acting as if it's like some sort of like big legal question. And in fact, yes, I mean there's not any jurisprudence that I'm aware of specifically regarding his circumstances, but we certainly don't see it as uncharted waters, right? We sort of have this logic of like, well, there's this law, and we have all the law that has come previously, and it's just a question of finding the right answer. That doesn't mean that there is always one answer, right? Like the court could come out in different ways, but I think there's this kind of conception that, like, the extent to which some of these things are up for debate is maybe a bit more narrow. But honestly, I don't know. I think a lot of it is tradition, right? Like, for example, I think if an American judge wrote such a quick reasoning, I don't know if it would be held up by higher courts. Whereas in France, this is more than acceptable.
Even a lower court would write it like this, because I would guess that courts in the U.S. that are not the Supreme Court are thinking about how a higher court is going to examine their decision if it comes to that. Is that not the case with lower courts in France? Would they be more likely to explain themselves a bit more when ruling on such a thing, or would they or how does that process work?
Right. So just to be clear for our listeners, right? When it involves the Tribunal of Conflicts, there's not really a lower court in the sense that there's no courts under the Tribunal of Conflicts. They're only there to resolve these kinds of disputes. But yes, in an ordinary circumstance, say at the lowest instance of the judicial jurisdiction, we call them now the judicial tribunals. They will have much longer decisions than when that case eventually gets to the Court of Cassation, but a large part of that is just because the lowest court is tasked with making decisions of fact. So let's take an example of a ferry that's operated, whether, as we now know, whether it's a private or a public person doesn't matter. But take a ferry service today. Imagine Liam is taking a ferry to from Paris to London, and the ferry sinks with all of Liam's baggage. Luckily, he survives. And so Liam wants to sue the ferry operator after the fact because he lost all of his bags, including his precious Royal Palace podcast microphone.
That would be a nightmare.
And so he sues them before the judicial tribunal, and they will have to rule on a number of questions. They'll have to say whether or not the ferry sunk at all. They'll have to say whether or not your bags were lost. Right? They'll have to decide all these questions of fact. But by the time it gets to the Court of Cassation, they don't examine questions of fact. They only examine legal questions. So in that sense, yes, lower court rulings tend to be longer because they have a lot more to examine. And very often, right, a lower court will have many legal rulings to make, if you will. But by the time it gets to the Court of Cassation, they only want to look at one of them, for example. So yes, they're longer, but they never reach the length that you will see in the U.S.
So what were the results of this case? Does this mean that after that, all public transport is considered a matter of private law?
So the result of all of this is that the judicial jurisdiction is competent for what will eventually, like, they don't use this terminology in the decision itself, but we get it later for what are called SPIC, which stands for public services of a industrial or commercial character. And so the distinction then is between those and SPAs, which are public administrative services. So from then on, we will make this distinction for things like compensation, like liability, right? But we'll also make the distinction for the actual status of people who work at these things. So, for example, one of the consequences of this decision and everything that comes after it is that if you work for a public ferry operator, you are subject to private law, meaning you are on a normal work contract as opposed to being a functionary, except for the director of it and the accountant. Because even though it's private, there's still a public aspect of it. So we want the accountant to be the head accountant to ensure that public finance rules are being respected. Because there are different rules for public and private finance in France, by the way. Now, another interesting thing here, and here's where I'm not going to get into the details here. This is a whole nother episode, but just like a teaser, if you will, is that the ferry case is very interesting and very different because it doesn't involve a physical piece of public works. And we'll get in again, topic for another episode. But when we're actually looking at public works themselves, like the actual act of doing it. So imagine you're building a ferry terminal and a public person is involved with that, and you get hurt from the construction of that ferry terminal, the works involved with it, then that is actually a question for the public jurisdiction.
Hmm.
Also, take a train in like an SNCF train. Yes, in the train car, you are clearly under the purview of the train company, and the basically the same ferry logic applies here. But when you're on the platform, you are on a result of public works. You're on public infrastructure. And if you, while using that public infrastructure, say the roof collapses on you, that is also a question for the public authority, like for the public jurisdiction, and not the private one. So this line that we just drew with this case from 1921 is actually not as fine as you might think.
Well, it's pretty fine. Pretty fine line.
Right. I just mean like for example, like
Yeah.
you might think, right, like the train station example, you might think that the train station is because it's operated by the SNCF, that if you get hurt using it, it's purely a question of private law.
What about SNCF employees that only work in the train station? Train station manager, something like that,
Well, those are private employees.
because they're employees of SNCF.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as listeners can probably tell, this is a very complicated distinction.
Now, you want to hear something really funny though?
Sure.
So the Ivory Coast would get its independence, and as I said, they have a council of state. And this council of state, unsurprisingly, was staffed by members of the French Council of State post independence.
Hmm.
Not entirely, but there were still connections.
Yeah. The same thing happened in British colonies in India when they gained independence. A lot of their judges were still British.
And this meant that the Council of State in the independent Ivory Coast decided the opposite when they had a similar case brought before it. So they actually decided in the Ivory Coast to abandon this French definition, this French distinction, and opt for public jurisdiction.
Hmm. Interesting.
So, how do you feel about our first case, Liam?
Good. Not exactly my wheelhouse, talking about cases as the listeners can hear, but it's certainly Patrick, so that's good.
One question I had is, how do you feel about this? Like after I've bored you with all the legal details and we've kind of examined somewhat intellectually these questions, how do you feel now looking back at where we started, like the facts of the case and the context this case was rendered in?
It's interesting in that it doesn't seem to matter for the purposes of the case. This is still the case that is like referenced as on these things, right? On these sort of matters, and made this important distinction. And yet it's in this context that seems so insane now of a French colony and extractive company, French company in this colony. No?
Yeah, no, I mean exactly. I mean, like my thought is really like, wow, we on one hand, I'm always impressed, and I think there's something to be admired about the ability. Like, I think good legal thinking can create a universal principle out of facts like this, right? Like something that's actually useful. Like bad bad legal reasoning would make a narrow holding that wouldn't be very useful, right? It would be like when it involves a ferry in the colony, right? Like they did in fact make meaningful law here. They did in fact make a meaningful interpretation of a real debate. But at the same time, it is a little bit crazy to think that, you know, the facts here, as you say, are kind of wild, kind of foreign, and it's kind of crazy that circumstances that do not hopefully exist today are nonetheless having such an influence on how we see this distinction today. And I think another thing that's kind of wild about this is that most people don't actually know the facts of this case. Like most people don't take the time to look into it. Maybe they'll know it involves a ferry in Africa, right? But most people are unaware of the colonial context, the details of the colonial context. And this is a common thing you see in the way French law is practiced, right? They'll cite the case, everyone knows the principle, but the actual facts are seldom looked at, and you rely on the facts that are given to you by the court, right? We know these facts because the court briefly summarized them at the top in one single paragraph. But of course, the Tribunal of Conflicts never went to the Ivory Coast to see what all this looks like, right? They did this all by telegram, basically. They got all the information by telegram, and them sitting in the royal palace in their robes and whatnot rendered this case.
It is fascinating to picture, especially if you don't know what the royal palace looks like or where it is, Google it, because yeah, it's just incredible to imagine. I mean, this facts of a place so far away being decided right in the center of Paris.
Yeah, and this still now. What's interesting is this thing happens still today. So for in the administrative jurisdiction, for example, there didn't used to be any administrative tribunals. It was just the Council of State. So if you had an administrative question that you wanted resolved, that had to go to court after you dealt with the administration itself, you would have to sue them in Paris, even if you lived in French Polynesia, which is on the complete opposite side of the world. And even today, there are some types of disputes between yourself and the government that can only be resolved by the Council of State at the Royal Palace in Paris. So yes, that means you're literally suing, at the time by telegram or letter, but now by digital services, thank God.
Another thing about this is that you mentioned that someone actually died on this ferry.
That's right.
Don't know if that ever made it to the courts. It certainly didn't have a big legal impact in the way that this did, just because this was a dispute between a French-run and owned company and the French government.
If I ever have more time, I would love to find where this case actually went. But to be honest, I haven't seen anything on it. And, this was in first instance. It probably stayed in first instance. So I have no idea where this ultimately went. Yeah, and it the reason this case is known is because it rise to the Tribunal of Conflicts, which is obviously going to keep good public records, and it made an impact on the law, so people retained it.
Yeah, but it would be interesting to know more about how more ordinary matters were being carried out legally in the colonies at this point.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. Another point of interest that I think will be interesting to cover one point, and again as a teaser to future episodes, I would love to look at the role of the Council of State and and the French administration during Vichy.
Oh, yes.
All right, that's it for this episode of the Royal Palace Podcast. We want to thank you all for listening. As a reminder, you can find our show notes on our wiki, and Liam has a Twitter that he runs because I hate Twitter.
Yes, feel free to find us on Twitter. Currently, almost all our followers on Twitter are Elon spam bots.
Yes, apparently the Royal Palace Podcast is listened to exclusively by young women with stolen or AI generated photos.
So shout out to those listeners.
La France est une chose, à mes yeux, très considérable. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Je veux dire par là qu'à mon sens, elle est quelque chose de très grand. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il y a même là quelque chose d'extraordinaire. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il faut que la France joue son rôle, c'est exact. Et pour qu'elle joue son rôle, il faut qu'elle soit la France.